Well, hello, everybody. This is David Meyers, the Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Alliance. And we are very pleased to have some special guests presenting a new report that they've produced. And we have Duko Hopman and Robert Wilson of McKinsey Co. that have they're co-authors of a recently produced study called Valuing Nature Conservation. And we're really excited to have them be able to present some of the results of this work. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. As usual, the methodology for this is going to be everyone, keep yourselves on mute. And if you do have questions you'd like to ask, write them into the chat box. You could do that during the course of the presentation. You can also do that afterwards during the Q&A session. And I will call on you based on your question that you've put in, and then you can unmute your microphone and ask the question directly. And very much looking forward to this, a fascinating paper, and hopefully will propel us forward to where we need to be with all the challenges that we're facing with nature. So over to you, Duko, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, David, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to share the findings of the report with you today, and to hear some of the questions and suggestions and feedback that the group will have. So I suggest we'll keep the presentation part relatively brief, 20 minutes or so, and then get into that discussion as quickly as we can. So I'm an associate partner in our New Jersey office. Brought with me also Rob Wilson, another author of the report, who's in our London office. So as a little bit of context, so this was an 8-month or so, 9-month effort to write this report. It's a independent McKinsey report, but in very close collaboration with some of the leading conservation organizations in the world, including WWF and the Moore Foundation and others. So I suggest I'll start sharing screen, and maybe as a bit of a disclaimer, I realize we have a lot of experts on this call, or exclusively experts on this call, and I'll be going through some concepts that I'll be preaching to the choir to some extent, and going through some concepts that are very familiar to you, but at the same time I think it's useful to take you through, at least in a couple of minutes, and how we're thinking about this, and why we decided that McKinsey may be able to make a contribution in this field. So the way we've been thinking about this, we've been thinking of this fictional CEO, and she's a pretty good CEO. In particular, she's quite good at making investment decisions based on the information that's brought to her, right? And weighing kind of cost and benefits, and then placing bets on the future. But the problem is that she only sees the downside of every investment decision. She sees the cost, the opportunity cost, the operating cost, the apex. She doesn't see the benefits, the long-term returns, or she only sees 10% of those returns or something like that. So even though she's quite capable at making these investment trade-offs, her team is not so great at bringing her the information that she needs to make those investment trade-offs. And predictably, this fictional CEO does not make a ton of investments. Right? And I think that's exactly kind of the analogy that we see in nature, where in most conservation, or at least space-based conservation decisions, it's abundantly clear what the costs are and the trade-offs are. It's a lot less clear what the benefits are. And again, predictably, we see a grave underinvestment in nature worldwide. So why is it that at a global level it is so clear what the benefits of nature conservation are, and at the local level it is so opaque and so hard to make those trade-offs? Because we do know at a global level that nature is a very worthwhile investment, right? From our own research, we find that reducing deforestation by 75% at minimum is required to achieve a 1.5 degree pathway. And similarly, it's getting more and more clear now, although research is of course still ongoing into the specific COVID-19 case, but a lot of research is coming out, as you've all read, that these outbreaks are very much linked to ecosystem fragmentation, not just because ecosystem fragmentation pushes humans closer into these wild areas, but also because the absence of thriving ecosystems mean that species such as bats and rats that are particularly prone to transferring these kind of diseases to humanity actually thrive. We also know that a lot of people depend on intact coral reefs for storm protection, 200 million people around the world. And we know, of course, that our food production depends heavily on crop pollination by not just the bee that you see here, but wild insect populations in wild areas around the globe. And we know, although this is one that we find in conversations with public leaders and other leaders is a little bit less well known, we know very well that rainfall generation in countries depends heavily on forested areas in those same countries. Right, so agriculture and other industries that would depend on that rainfall heavily depends on intact ecosystems as well. Ecotourism, another one that we, quite frankly, were a little bit shocked to learn just how large this is, just how large tourism in general is. 1 in 10 people employed in tourism around the world, not this year perhaps, but hopefully one year soon again. And ecotourism is a substantial part of that, right? Protected area tourism alone is some $300 billion in revenues a year, which is certainly comparable with the numbers that would be required to fund conservation worldwide. And then it's not just land-based agriculture; it's annual fish catch that depends heavily on intact wild populations and is a very sizable industry in its own right. So these are just a couple of examples. I know this group would probably be able to list dozens more. But again, I think what we find perplexing, what might be the problems to solve here is that although we've got these ecosystem services relatively well quantified at a global level, and we understand the benefits to humanity relatively well at a global level, it is still very hard to size those specific ecosystem services for individual conservation projects, for individual ecosystems where we do need to put that, we need to put those benefits into balance against the opportunity cost and of the alternative or the operating and capex costs of running a conservation project. And so, like I said, predictably, we know that natural capital is declining at unprecedented rates because these investments aren't made. 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction. The recent WWF report shows that 68% of wild populations are in decline in the last, say, 50 years. We know that deforestation has accelerated to unprecedented rates, that fish stocks are collapsing worldwide, that these reefs that 200 million people worldwide depend on for crucial storm protection. By the way, storm protection that will only be needed more in a changing climate world, and that we're losing mangroves, a particularly valuable ecosystem, at unprecedented rates as well. So what we wanted to do comes down to this balance again, comes down to helping the CEO make the trade-offs that we think would tip in favor of conservation investments much more often if we would start to put ecosystem services on the other side of that scale, on the benefit side of that scale for individual conservation projects. And although we were definitely not able to size every one of these ecosystem services at a granular geospatial scale, we tried to put some of the larger ones on the left-hand side of that scale and see where that scale would end up for areas around the world. So I think I'll hand off to Rob here, but basically what we did and where we think as McKinsey that we could contribute is not just doing the analytics on this one at a highly granular scale, highly granular to kind of in the acknowledgement that the global trade-off is not that worthwhile here. We know that nature is a worthy investment at a global scale. What we don't know is where locally it is a worthy investment, right? So that's why we try to do this at a highly granular geospatial scale to make it relevant for individual stakeholders, for individual decision makers, for governors of provinces, for CEOs of private sector companies that are considering their own supply chains. And then we wanted to end up with highly pragmatic suggestions, including specific alliances that we think would be helpful in addressing these issues and taking this further. So anyway, I'll hand over to Rob to take us through some of the picture that is emerging from these analytics that we've been conducting.
Thanks, Duko. So, as Duko was saying, we decided that the more granular that we could get in terms of understanding how these scales, the balance of benefits and costs, would change for each individual potential conservation area, the more informed and the better and more compelling those investment cases might be. And so that's exactly what we did. We tried to get as detailed as possible and analyze that cost-benefit relationship for the benefits and costs we were able to quantify at a global scale in different areas. So Duko, just on the next slide, please. So we did this globally and at a highly granular geospatial level. We analyzed every 5 by 5 kilometer pixel on the planet to understand the potential impact of conservation on climate, economics, human health, and biodiversity. And we purposefully chose those areas, climate, economics, and human health, to be relatively to have a relatively broad coverage of impacts, although understanding that in each of those areas there are multiple different impacts that we wouldn't be able to measure. And then biodiversity, of course, underpinning all of that. So the metrics that we chose to measure were the CO2 reduction from avoided deforestation and natural regrowth. Importantly, we chose to measure jobs, and we split this into direct jobs from conservation activities, as well as jobs and GDP that are safeguarded by nature-dependent markets. And the specific markets that we measured were ecotourism and sustainable fishing. Again, both of these are enormous, and we felt like we were able to quantify a meaningful chunk of the opportunity by doing those two. We quantified the expanded habitat range of species at risk of extinction, and lastly, a proxy for the reduction in zoonotic disease risk, not the reduction itself, by keeping ecosystems intact. Again, obviously highly relevant at the moment in the current context. And then obviously to make that meaningful in a cost-benefit analysis, we compared it to the cost of protection. So how did we actually do this? It was a 3-step process. We started by establishing a baseline of existing protected areas around the world. And the map that you're looking at the moment is all of the world's existing protected areas on land and in national waters. We chose to exclude international waters from this analysis because, as you'll know, the percentage protection is very low at the moment. And with the negotiations on how to achieve this, we wanted our recommendations to be as immediately pragmatic and useful as possible, hence why we didn't include that in the analysis. So this covers the 16% of land and 17% of national waters, including EEZs, that are currently protected. And as we were building this baseline, we also thought about whether or not areas were likely to be sufficiently protected. The way in which we decided to do that for a global analysis like this was to consider existing human footprint and the rate at which that was changing relative to its surrounding areas. So for all of these protected areas, the tens of thousands of protected areas, we analyzed how quickly or how much the existing human pressure was increasing. And then for the areas where it was increasing faster than the surrounding areas, we said that those areas were potential candidates, potential priority candidates for enhanced protection, and we considered those within our solution space for the impact of expanded protection. So the next thing that we did was to prioritize additional areas to conserve, covering 30% of land and national waters. And we chose to base the analysis in the 30 by 2030 target, given the momentum that it's received. Obviously, since we published the report, a number of new countries such as Canada and the UK have joined in publicly committing to the 30 by 2030 target, and it's been included within the post-2020 draft. So this felt like as good as any as a sort of basis for our analysis. We needed a spatial number, and this felt like a pretty good one to use. So again, for every 5 by 5 kilometer pixel on land, and it's actually every 30 by 30 kilometer pixel in national waters, we analyzed where we thought the priority areas were to protect. And I'll cover in a minute how we chose those priority areas. We then analyzed the impacts of that protection across the metrics that I mentioned before. And we found that those impacts could be up to 2.6 gigatons of CO2 in terms of annual reduction from the atmosphere, up to 30 million jobs and 500 billion of GDP in ecotourism and sustainable fishing alone. And we know that obviously the GDP impact of conservation would actually be much higher than this. So this just provides a helpful sort of minimum stake in the ground for those two industries only. It would create up to 650,000 direct jobs in nature conservation, which in the context of the green recovery is particularly relevant. It would expand the conserved habitat of threatened species by up to 2.8 times for an effective doubling of nature conservation, which then demonstrates that the areas that we're conserving are particularly effective at expanding the habitat of endangered species. And as we know, it would help reduce the risk of zoonotic diseases. Now, to do this, we decided to create 6 scenarios of protection. And rather than basing it on some of the various different sort of real life situations that have been discussed, knowing that the chances of any one of these sort of becoming the exact reality was quite low, we instead chose to model these 6 scenarios using, I guess, sort of theoretical scenarios where you would, for example, perfectly protect 30% of every country or perfectly protect 30% of every ecoregion. The reason that we did that was because it enabled us to explore the trade-off decisions more clearly. So we created those six scenarios by considering 2 spatial constraints, which are the 3 columns on the left, by considering spatial constraints, which are the 3 columns on the left, and by considering optimization criteria, which are the 3 columns on the right, together making 6 different scenarios. So for example, looking at scenario 1, that protects 30% of every country and optimizes for species protection and carbon stocks. Whereas scenario 6 protects 30% of every ecozone, which is the same as a realm, and not that dissimilar to kind of continents. And instead of optimizing for carbon stocks, it optimizes for minimizing the impact on human activity. So species optimization was a must and included for all of them. And then we played between carbon stocks and human activity, exploring that trade-off. So some of those trade-offs then were relatively predictable. As you'd expect, the higher the impact of conservation on existing human activity, then the greater the benefit in terms of the other things that we were making that trade-off against, like CO2 abatement, for example. But it also benefited species extinction and zoonotic disease risk. So that was altogether not that surprising, but helped us to explore the degree of the trade-off between those two. Some of the trade-offs were a little bit less predictable, and one of those was the trade-off between opportunity costs and operating costs. Now, we considered that the impact on existing human activity was a proxy for opportunity costs, and we quantified the ongoing operating costs. And what we found was that when we were optimizing for minimizing the impact on human activity, then that would actually result in smaller protected areas, which is the chart on the shape on the right. Now, because those smaller protected areas lose some of the economies of scale, that actually becomes a more expensive conservation solution in terms of operating costs. Hence, there's a trade-off between minimizing the opportunity costs and the operating costs. Another really interesting insight that we found was that across the board, in terms of carbon abatement and species protection and employment, the urgency, cost, and benefit distribution of conservation is uneven. In the chart that you can see on this page, the blue circles represent the total opportunity from carbon abatement impact in specific biomes. So, for example, tropical and subtropical moist broadleaf forests is one of those biomes. The blue square represents the cost per unit of impact. So in this case, the cost per ton of CO2. And what you can see then is that the biomes that are most at risk, which are the ones on the left-hand side, so tropical and subtropical moist broadleaf forests are on average most at risk, also deliver the majority of the CO2 abatement potential and deliver it at a significantly lower cost. This provides quite a compelling view of the opportunity from investing in conservation in some areas relative to others. Now, we realize that at a global scale, obviously, this is a gross simplification, because there will be areas that, although on average are at a lower risk, actually have specific areas that are very high risk. But the principle of this analysis could be applied to any scale. So you could apply this to a specific region within a country, for example, and identify the areas that are most at risk, have the highest opportunity and the lowest cost per impact. And that there's a decent chance that those three would align. So that's the picture for carbon abatement, but we saw a very similar shape to this chart for employment. Again, on the left-hand side, the biggest opportunity, lowest costs, and the greatest risk, so the greatest sense of urgency. So we saw that for employment, we saw it for zoonotic disease risk mitigation, and we saw it for species at risk, which is in the final slide. So what can we then do with this analysis? We conducted this at a global scale, and it provided really interesting global insights into the costs and benefit of conservation. But at a local level is obviously where these decisions get most relevant, and where geospatial analysis also presents an enormous opportunity, which is probably not fully, well, it's definitely not fully exploited at the moment. We've chosen a fictitious example here to kind of illustrate this point, partly because when you get it down into a local level, you're suddenly presented with a lot more data, there's a lot more nuance, and you would need to refine this analysis, which is exactly what we will do when we apply it at the local level. But it means that with geospatial analysis, you can quite quickly understand in a country, where are the protected areas, where are the ones that maybe could be priority candidates for protection, where are the areas that you might consider protecting as your next priorities, and then what are the impacts of doing that? What's the climate impact, what's the economic impact, the health impact, crucially the overlap with lands which are under the stewardship of indigenous people, and what's the cost of doing that in terms of the setup costs, run rate costs, but also the opportunity costs.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah. So what's next, basically, for us, right? So this was a first attempt at doing this at a global scale with some level of granularity. I think what we're trying to solve for, and what the question that we get from CEOs and public sector leaders can be broken up in three parts, right? What is basic? What should we do, right? What should our commitment be? What is our baseline? What is our current footprint? And how can we base any commitment or pledge decisions based on that? And then the second one is, so how can we achieve those targets, right? What should we actually do? And the third one is, how do we track and communicate this progress? So what we now have is we set up a dedicated nature analytics group of data scientists that are essentially trying to add more and more to that left side of the scale, to size more and more of those ecosystem services, and do it at a scale that is useful for individual decision makers. So that means even more granular than 5 by 5 kilometers, but it also means non-spatial axes, like commodities or supply chains or any other axes that would be relevant for individual decision makers. And then we're trying to put that into a broader socioeconomic context to base those decisions on. So that was the 20 or 25-minute version of the report inside. So thank you very much, and it would be great to get your feedback and thoughts and suggestions for how to take this forward, or what else to look into, and of course any questions that you have on the report itself.
Thank you so much, Duko and Rob. Really fascinating stuff. You know, one of the challenges I would say we experience in conservation finance is kind of transferring what we know to be the economic value of nature into finance terms, into monetary terms, and ultimately, in a way, you know, into dollars, because the economic value is clear. You know, without food, we wouldn't last very long, right? Clean water, things like that. So the problem is complex, and that, and you alluded to some of these, and that, you know, it's hard to measure them. You have public goods, you have things like that, you know. So in theory, government should handle a lot of this because it's for the public well-being and things like that, but they don't necessarily. They have competing interests and stuff like that. So we do want to see ways of bringing you know, the private sector in and other solutions, but, you know, from being able to quantify the GDP, jobs, and things like that, in my opinion, is really a crucial step forward, and it's something that it's nice to see. And I know it's not a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis, but really it's moving us in the right direction. So
I think an interesting point on that, the fact that it's not comprehensive, I completely agree. And it should, you know, of course, we should try to make it as comprehensive as possible. At the same time, we were involved in a project to create a series of large national parks in a country. That effort had been stuck for years, right? And at some point we got to, and of course we were dealing mostly with the Minister of Environment. At some point we quantified some of the benefits that national park, or a series of national parks, could have. And it was a very underwhelming number, actually, right? Because we were only able to size a very small subset of benefits. But it was at least a subset that accrued to the country itself, ultimately to the taxpayer, to the finance minister itself, right? So even though it was an extremely underwhelming number in the context of the, you know, the trillions of dollars numbers that we're used to looking at this problem from a geospatial, from a global scale, that was the unlock in the end, right? When the finance minister saw that this flipped the country from a tax negative to a modestly tax positive region, that was sufficient, right? So it's not always the impressive numbers that matter, it's the specificity and the accrual to the decision makers that matter.
Very well said. Yeah, that's the same experience we had with the Biodiversity Finance Initiative globally with the UNDP project. You know, we just, you know, when we talk to the Minister of Finance, they're kind of interested in tax revenue and things like that. And when you point that out, it really makes a huge difference. And so again, all these tools are, you know, could help tip the scales just ever so slightly, or just convince the right person. In the end, you know, a lot of it, the numbers end up getting us to the table, but in a way you have to still convince people through emotional appeals, or, you know, that kind of thing, unfortunately, because private interests often dominate over social interests, unfortunately. So, well, I have so many questions, but I'd love to open it up to the audience here to give them a chance to ask you things. I can see we've got a few questions coming in here. Well, let me just open it up with the first one. Paquita, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, that'd be great.
Thank you so much, guys. This is super interesting. I would love to know if it's possible to get breakdowns of the data for individual countries or places where we're working to, take those numbers to the table and help convince key stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so currently we haven't, there's no kind of interactive or kind of open source version of this yet on our website or anything like that, but you can certainly, like we can make any of those views. So I would ask that you contact me and then we can work that out. So I'll put my email address in the chat so that you could reach out.
Great. Thank you so much, Duko.
One thing perhaps to add there as well, Duko, is like I was alluding to when I presented that fictitious example, and one of the reasons that we made it a fictitious example there is because although the scope of this report was a global analysis, and the global analysis is vastly improved because of how granular we were able to get in terms of that geospatial analysis. That said, when you do look at it at a country level, there is such a big opportunity to then add additional data sets that aren't available globally, and to run the model at a local scale, which will create a refinement of the analysis when you limit the solution space to only being the country. And so that's one of the reasons why actually when we look at it on a country level basis, it does make sense to apply that nuance, and rather than start to make decisions even at a country or regional level basis based on the raw data prior to that refinement.
Excellent. So next question is coming from Chris Parker. Very interesting one about ESG investing. Chris, if you unmute yourself and go right ahead and ask, if that's possible. Give me another second or two. Okay, I'm not hearing you, so I'm going to just ask your question for you because it's a really good one. A general inquiry about developing and standardizing biodiversity metrics for use in ESG investing and or biodiversity offset marketplace. So I'm not sure if you understand.
Yeah, I'm guessing the question is what would be the value, or would we be? I don't think we don't currently see ourselves as well positioned to create those standardized metrics, but I completely agree, having gone through the painful work for 9 months of trying to value and size some of these benefits, I completely agree that it would be a game changer, right? To have better standardized metrics to base these type of analyses and offset markets on would make all the difference, and probably one of the reasons why CO2 is the most advanced of these offset markets is because it's the most easily quantified.
Right, absolutely. And there's a new task force on nature-based disclosures that does developing in the UK and Europe, and that could be a real interesting tie-in to link on this.
Absolutely.
Joe Pike had a question, and Joe, if you want to ask it, please unmute yourself.
Thanks, David, and thank you for a really clear and inspiring presentation. I just wanted to come back to the fictitious CEO at the very beginning. I thought that was a really nice way of opening it, and I just wondered how you were defining investments. Are you looking at a CEO who's thinking about how that company spends its money in all of the ways it does business in such a way as to benefit biodiversity and justify that to shareholders through maybe avoided costs or business growth? Or are you looking at investing in the sense of investing externally to deliver a financial return at more arm's length, or is that all in the mix?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, I mean, it's all and more. I think that's in the mix. I think when I was using the analogy of the CEO, I meant kind of any decision maker, right? I think in my mind that could be the provincial governor or the head of state or a minister of finance or a private sector CEO or BU CEO, like anyone who has to make the trade-off of allocating funds to conservation or the alternative, and whether the alternative is investing in another private sector opportunity or converting forest to agriculture. I think the analogy would, in my mind, works for both, right? I think in both cases, allocation of resources to conservation will be suboptimal if the information disbalance continues to be in place, where the costs are more obvious than the benefits.
Okay, no, thank you. That makes sense. Do I have time to ask a quick follow-up to that, or?
Sure, go ahead, Joe.
So it's just, I suppose, in reality, one of the challenges of conservation finance is that the costs and the benefits are not always part of a closed loop. So it might be the case that a company could invest in whatever way and derive those benefits, but it may also be the case that a company invests, but those benefits are societal. And I just wondered how much discussion you'd given to that difference between a societal case and the business case.
Yeah, yes, it's a very valid and complex point. Of course, the point of accrual to different stakeholders, right? Benefits and cost accrual to different stakeholders. I think on the public side, at least, I think our sense through the analytics in this report is that is often overestimated, right? I think including by public decision makers. I think a lot of public decision makers have the sense that this is a story of local cost and global benefits. I think we find in our, correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but I think in our, if we look at individual areas that we assessed, and these are thousands and thousands of areas around the world, over 60% of them, the benefits in terms of GDP created by ecotourism and fisheries alone was larger than the operating cost of conservation there, right? And that doesn't take into account a whole slew of other local benefits. And I think that same story, although it's harder to view that through the geospatials that we have right now, that same story might be true on the private sector side and individual supply chains that are currently at risk of through the degradation of natural capital. But I'm sure there will be many cases in which it still exists, and that's where things like jurisdictional approaches or other kind of more collective approaches would need to come into the mix to address those gaps. I still think it's very important to create a transparency that shows that disbalance in accrual, right? For example, that what we also found through the constraint that Rob outlined that we had to apply to the model of like what do we even mean by 30%, right? Do we mean 30% of every country? Do we mean 30% of the globe? It's unlikely that a UN target, which will ultimately have to be implemented through member states, will be interpreted as 30% of the globe, right? Which means that through that geospatial constraint of saying it would have to be at a country level or at least at kind of a regional level, you're likely to miss out on some pretty critical ecosystems that just don't make it to that 30% because they're in countries that just have an enormous amount of natural capital, more than 30% of their land area, right? So by making that transparent, you're also highlighting the need for more collective approaches, financing approaches, and implementation approaches to that problem.
Thanks very much.
Perhaps one additional thought to add there. Well, on the, I'm not sure, I can't quite remember whether your 60% stat was right, Duko. It might well be, but the one that we published in the report is that the benefit in over half of the thousands of areas that we analysed, the benefits are 3 times larger than the cost, which is obviously, when you start looking at benefits purely from ecotourism or sustainable fishing being 3 times larger than the cost, which then doesn't include even all of the dollar benefits you'd get from other ecosystem services that haven't been quantified, or if you applied, for example, a dollar value to carbon, whether that's through carbon offset revenues or the societal value of carbon, then very quickly you start looking at really compelling investment cases. On the tragedy of the commons example that you're referring to, I think one of the charts that really illustrates that, well, are the 4 charts that I was talking about just towards the end, with the squares and the circles showing the urgency, the benefit, and the cost. And it kind of looks like a no-brainer when you look at those charts. You know, they're really, some of these areas are really, really at risk, really urgent to protect. Therefore, the benefits are enormous and the costs are really low. Why are they not being protected? And it's exactly that issue that you describe. And that's at a global level, but obviously that will also apply at all spatial levels.
Yeah, and when you go down to the really local level, it's individual decisions. You know, what do I cut down a piece of forest and feed my family versus, you know, and so that's where ultimately you do need government, and I'm going to, since I have the soapbox, I'm going to stand on it. You know, that regulations can bring a lot of these costs and benefits internal to company decision making. You know, and really it does, in the end, if we want the scale that we hope for, it does require governments to, you know, accept and embrace the kind of you know, regulation and enforcement that aligns interests in ways that that brings this equation in line with private, you know, and public activity. So just throwing that out there, as I usually do. Kevin, you had a question that was more or less answered, but would you like to pose some thoughts here, share some thoughts? If you're still there, Kevin? Okay, I'm not hearing you. All right, and Jeff Giacomini, you had a comment, which I thought was quite interesting. It'd be great if you could share that.
Sure, thank you. My comment was here focused on the public, the people who are not conservationists, those of us who have children and grandparents and parents who don't necessarily understand payment for ecosystem services. And so it was just a comment, but I think that the way that we pose this and present it to a more general public, still assuming, you know, they're an intelligent public, but without the knowledge that we as conservationists have, I think branding is an important issue. How do you sell this how do you convince people that ecosystems, which they might understand, are really valuable? Nature is not free could be a better way of talking about ecosystem services and paying for it. Again, this is just a comment and not necessarily a question, but I would love to hear some of the thoughts from the presenters and any other questions that ensue. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jeff. And in better times, when Rob and I could still stand next to each other at a whiteboard, we used that to actually, you know, we spent hours on trying to figure out a framework that might be a little bit more intuitive than the ecosystem services framework. We didn't really find one, but I completely agree that a rebranding effort could be extremely helpful. And again, I would also say it's not just the terminology that we use. I think it's also the specificity in who actually benefits from those ecosystem services that is crucial. You can probably get the general public on board with a technical term like that, but you can probably, like the global metrics I find are much harder to convey, right? The trillions of dollars are just not intuitive enough for any individual to feel like they're benefiting from individual decisions. But yeah, completely agree, Jeff.
Great.
Just on that point on language, you may notice in the report we actually didn't use the traditional ecosystem services framework, not because we don't think it's not kind of correct and you know, possibly even the most accurate way of thinking about it, but we do find that a lot of people find it difficult to relate to who are new to the concept of ecosystem services, and we wanted the report to speak to people who hadn't heard of the term before, and so we did speak about it differently in terms of climate change mitigation and resilience, economic security and opportunity, and health and culture. So just one to think about in terms of framing, and would love any thoughts after this. If you think that doesn't make any sense, or you think it's great, let us know.
Great. Looks like we have about three more questions and 3 or 4 more questions. So I will keep asking people if they'd like to speak. Alicia Ruiz, if you'd like to share your question.
Yes. First of all, thank you for the information. I'm coming from the public sector side in Peru. I work for the Ministry of Environment, and we're trying to promote the greening of the financial system beyond climate change. And we are taking biodiversity and conservation topics very seriously. So I think these kind of messages add a lot of clarity towards we want to go. So and you're more than invited to share those messages in the process we're doing. We would love to have your insights. My question was more like in the sense of advice from what you've been doing with these research. What would be the approach you suggest coming from the Ministry of Environment towards the financial actors? Like, what could be a way to approach them and get their interest in this?
Thanks, Alicia, and I'm happy to discuss further, of course, specific to Peru. But I think to me, it again comes back to the transparency of both the up and the downside, right? If the Ministry of Environment, and I think that Minister Rodriguez, or the former Minister Rodriguez of Costa Rica, felt quite strongly that it helped to have a dual ministry, right, of energy and environment combined. But let's say that it is a more siloed Ministry of Environment. I think a role that the ministry can play is still creating and encouraging creation of the transparency of the value of nature and the risks of the degradation of natural capital. Right? And if banks start to price that in a way that is now being championed by financial institutions such as BlackRock, that in itself will likely shift investment quite a bit. Right? If companies start to understand, and if banks start to understand for example, if you only take the sliver of climate risk itself, the climate risk that they're taking on in their books, they would likely shift resourcing quite a lot already, right? So if the Minister of Environment specific to an individual country can help to create that transparency, create those metrics, and encourage banks to start pricing in those externalities, positive and negative, that in itself is a very valuable role, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, great, thanks. Question from Noella. This is more a technical one about data. Noella, if you're able to unmute yourself, I'd like to ask the question.
Yeah, I have a question because I'm very much impressed by the granular level of data that you collected here, and working with conservation finance research as well. I know that it's very complicated to get data many times, especially at this level for all countries as you do, including also in the ocean. So I'm very curious how you access the primary data at this level.
So we should have started out with a little bit more humility. I think that we definitely did not collect primary data at a geospatial scale for every 5x5 kilometer. I think we used 38,000 or so data layers for every one of the 6 million pixels that we assessed around the globe. So we had to stand on the shoulders of the many giants that collected those data before us. So what we added to the mix is really more to combining it in a way that we think is helpful for individual decision makers. I mean, Rob, maybe you can give some flavor to some of the data sets that we use, but we didn't collect any primary data ourselves.
Yeah, it's all publicly available data. The technical appendix, I think as Duko wrote in the chat, will be available in a week or two, and that includes all of the public data that we leveraged, and some of it which we bought.
Great. Plenty of chance to dig into that detail, which really, again, it's so much information's out there. It's pulling it together in the right way that really makes it useful. Sid Embry, you are working on a biodiversity bond. Let's hear about that. If you're able to unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. Super, super interesting. Yeah, I was working late last night on a deliverable for the Inter-American Development Bank and the French government, which have expressed an interest in designing a biodiversity bond. And, one of the things we struggled with is adding, or I guess it's adding, because there are additional costs associated with, if you're looking at a portfolio of investments, say of an oil and gas producer or a large-scale agricultural commodities company, what do they need to do to, take into account biodiversity, in a better way than they have in the past? And that really, there are two main areas. One is, through internal changes in operations, and particularly right at the land use, at the land level, the property level. And then secondly, there are probably external efforts that they could or should undertake as well, and that could include supporting like smallholder farmers through smaller scale investments, but also what was mentioned by Duko and Robert, which are these more landscape type of approach. Now, I'm not sure if it's landscape, but it might be ecosystem, connectivity, but really looking at engaging with local stakeholders and looking at identifying potential impacts beyond the property, if you will. And, I come from a project finance background, having worked at the IFC for over 18 years, and everything has to be put in a fence. And even avoided deforestation projects, typically like RED projects, they need to be, in a property. There are leakage, considerations. I think that the carbon analogy has been useful, but we're going to have to broaden that beyond, just the carbon to look at, societal interactions, and threats like fires and climate change. And so it really becomes, in a way, the responsibility of everybody to look beyond their property. But anyway, those are just an early findings. We're working on this over the next several months. So thank you again for a great presentation, and also to CFA for hosting this.
Pleasure. Thanks, Sid. Did you guys want to comment, or should I move to Scott's question?
I'm impressed that you're taking this. It seems like I'm not surprised that it takes a couple of late nights to get that together. It would be great to learn more.
Excellent. Scott Lampman, I know you said it's just a quick comment, but it's always good to hear your thoughts.
No, I was going to defer a comment to the next question, but briefly, it was just the fact that I think whenever I see a polygon placed on a map, I think we collectively tend to underestimate costs because those are not unpopulated lands. And there's a lot of displacement, physical and economic, for instance, for the landholders. So that was just a comment I made.
Yeah, well, I do think it's relevant, though, to the study in many ways, in that, as you mentioned earlier, it was hard to include all the costs and benefits, and of course, opportunity cost was one of the things that it was left out, because it's usually the only thing that we measure. But maybe you could talk about that and how you might integrate that into decision making as you go forward, or even into the modeling as you go forward.
Yeah, it's a very important limitation, of course, right? And that's why I think it's one of the reasons why we haven't put the maps online, and right, because I think what we want to message here is also that this is a starting point, right? This is an initial view, and any decision making will require much more detailed feasibility and cost benefit analyses at a more regional or local level. And opportunity costs are key in that, of course. I think we took a couple of major shortcuts to get to a global and yet granular answer, and this is certainly one of them. But yeah, data sets on opportunity costs, data sets on land costs, etc., are available in some countries, not available in others. Right? So at a country level or regional level, some of these geospatial analyses become much more useful, or a useful phase 2 after this. But even then, of course, you need on-the-ground discussions and on-the-ground feasibility studies before an actual decision is made.
Just to maybe quickly add to that, Duko, one of the reasons that we didn't include opportunity costs, partly because it's extremely difficult to do with any degree of kind of accuracy or robustness at a global scale. Obviously, when you get down to a more local scale, it becomes much more practically easy to actually lean on that analysis. One of our ingoing assumptions was that 30 by 2030 has to happen. And so we therefore pinned the analysis on 30% protection. And then once we'd done that, we then optimized, as I was explaining in those 6 scenarios, to either consider and optimize for existing human activity, or to not do so, and instead to optimize for carbon stocks. So half of our scenarios avoid as much as possible placing protection areas where there is existing human presence and activity. But it isn't that's a proxy for opportunity cost. It's obviously not a true opportunity cost in the complete sense.
What we find in conservation finance is that you need to take these opportunity costs into consideration even at the local level, but there are mechanisms to like compensate people. For example, if you know the overall economic benefit is clearly larger, then you manage those opportunity costs as part of the process, part of the project, and part of the investment, for example. So there's ways of dealing with it at all levels, I think, eventually, but it gets quite complicated, especially when your opportunity cost is palm oil and the returns are very, very high. That was just a quick promotion from Luis Gamara there about their conservation work in the Amazon in the chat box. I'm not going to call on you, but Sam Barkley has a great question here, and I think we'll end on that one. Sam, if you're able to unmute yourself, that would be great. If not, I'm going to go ahead and read it. All right. Based on your analysis, if you were given $1 trillion to spend over the next 10 years on one specific investment, let's be a little more flexible, on a group of targeted investments, where would you spend it? Biggest bang for the buck, hypothetical, taking into account your framework here: GDP, jobs, conservation, ecotourism, etc. Here you guys go. $1 trillion. Let's hear it.
It's really, so we'll answer it with the restrictions that we just spoke about, that we didn't take into account opportunity costs and some of the other costs, right? So I'll look through that lens when I'm answering it. And then with that lens, $1 trillion is a decent chunk of change, right? And that's, I think, something that we found that I think we were surprised by, is that the actual operating costs and all that are not all that high, especially through the lens of the current stimulus funding and packages that are being passed in the post-COVID recovery context. So with $1 trillion, I think we size, Rob, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're saying that the additional conservation that would add up to 30%, which is not necessarily the right target, but the one that we use to constrain the solution space for our analysis, adding to 30%, annual operating costs would be something in the vicinity of $20 to $45 billion additional to current spending, right? So for 10 years, you would still, you could easily do that with $1 trillion. And then where would you start? Where would you have the biggest bang for your buck? I think this is the analysis or the finding that Rob was highlighting, that is more often than not a fairly easy task, the prioritization, because we find that areas that are most at risk are the same areas, more often than not, the same areas that are high in benefits and low in cost, right? Low in operating cost. So you can basically work, for more often than not, policymakers can work their way from the areas that are highest at risk to the ones that are lowest at risk, and still get public support because of the benefits that are derived from those areas. So basically, given that we have $1 trillion, I would do it all, right? I would get to 30% and then consider whether a higher target is necessary or not.
Excellent. All right. Well, so if anyone's on the call with $1 trillion, please let us know. We've got a plan. And I want to thank both of you and your colleagues for doing this work. And thank you so much for sharing it with us and sharing it with the membership. And look forward to seeing the technical reports and look forward to more from you guys. So wish you the best of luck.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening. All right.